Beneath the Mediterranean, stone columns rest in geometric patterns older than the pyramids. The structures at Atlit Yam, submerged 9,000 years ago when rising seas claimed the coastline, include a stone semicircle surrounding a freshwater spring, dwellings with plastered floors, and human remains that reveal the earliest known cases of tuberculosis. What were they building in that circle? The arrangement suggests ritual purpose, astronomical function, or perhaps both. Mainstream archaeology interprets it as ceremonial gathering space. Others wonder if it served as an acoustic chamber, its stones positioned to amplify sound from the spring's flowing water. Hello, welcome. It might be late where you are, or perhaps you found this moment between the day's demands and tomorrow's concerns. Either way, I'm grateful you're here. Tonight, we're going beneath the waves to explore one of the most remarkable archaeological sites you've probably never heard of. A complete Neolithic village that offers an extraordinary window into life 9,000 years ago, preserved in sediment and silence. Atlit Yam sits 200 to 400 meters offshore from the modern Israeli coast, 8 to 12 meters below the surface. Marine archaeologist Ehud Galili discovered it in 1984 during routine survey work. The site spans approximately 40,000 square meters. What makes it extraordinary isn't just its age or preservation, it's the completeness. We have houses with stone foundations, hearths still holding charcoal, storage pits containing animal bones, and that mysterious stone semicircle. 7 megaliths arranged around a spring that still flows fresh water into the salt sea. Scholars have studied this configuration for decades. Some emphasize its similarity to other Neolithic ritual sites across the Levant. Others point to the spring's unique acoustic properties, the way certain frequencies resonate within the stone arrangement. Both interpretations rest on solid archaeological reasoning. Both reveal something true about human impulse toward meaning-making. We're not here to settle which interpretation wins. We're here to explore the questions themselves, to wonder what it means that 9,000 years ago, people invested enormous labor in moving stones that weighed hundreds of kilograms, arranging them with precision around a freshwater source. That impulse, that need to mark sacred space or encode knowledge in stone, it connects us across unimaginable spans of time. Take a breath if you'd like. Notice where you are right now, maybe in bed, maybe in a chair, maybe somewhere I can't imagine. Let your shoulders settle. You don't need to do anything with this information except let it wash over you, the way Mediterranean currents move over those ancient stones. If this exploration brings you some measure of calm or wonder, I'd be grateful if you'd consider subscribing or leaving a like. It helps others find their way to these quiet corners of history. So we descend. Imagine the shift from air to water, that moment when sound changes quality, when breath becomes something you hold rather than take for granted. The site rests on what was once coastal plain, a landscape of oak and olive, of seasonal streams feeding into estuaries now drowned. The people who lived here were among the last pre-pottery Neolithic communities, standing at the threshold between nomadic and settled existence. They harvested barley and wheat. They kept domesticated animals, sheep, goats, pigs, cattle. They dove for seafood, as evidenced by ear damage and skeletal remains consistent with deep water pressure. And they built something around that spring, something that demanded precision, that required understanding of weight and balance, and the properties of stone. What knowledge moved through their hands as they positioned those megaliths? What did they hear when water flowed between the standing stones? The answers rest in sediment, in the careful notation of archaeologists' surveys, in the slow accretion of evidence. We have evidence aplenty, artifacts numbered in thousands, skeletons that tell stories of diet and disease, pollen samples that reconstruct the ancient environment. We're about to explore a world both alien and recognizable, preserved by the same waters that claimed it. Long before anyone built circles of stone around springs, the Mediterranean coastline lay kilometers farther out than it rests today. Sea levels stood 60 meters lower during the last glacial maximum, exposing vast coastal plains that stretched where fishing boats now drift. The land we're exploring existed as fertile lowland, fed by streams that cut channels through limestone bedrock. Picture the climate then, warmer than the ice age that preceded it, but still adjusting. Around 10,000 BCE, as glaciers released their grip on northern latitudes, weather patterns shifted across the eastern Mediterranean. Rainfall increased, temperatures moderated. The stark landscape of the Younger Dryas period gave way to conditions that invited settlement, that made farming possible where only hunting had made sense before. The coastal plain where Atlit Yam would eventually stand supported oak forests mixed with pistachio and almond trees. Seasonal streams flowed year-round, fed by increased precipitation. Freshwater springs bubbled up through limestone formations, creating pools that attracted game. The land sloped gently toward the sea, offering sightlines across kilometers of open terrain. Perhaps the most remarkable feature was the springs themselves. Limestone aquifers channeled rainwater from inland highlands, releasing it at predictable points along the coastal plain. These weren't small seeps. Some flowed with enough volume to create permanent pools, oases that remained cool even during summer heat. The water emerged at consistent temperatures, typically 16 to 18 degrees Celsius, regardless of season. Standing near one of these springs 11,000 years ago, you would have felt the temperature shift, cooler air pooling around the water, creating microclimates that extended 20 or 30 meters outward. The sound would have been constant, that particular music of flowing water over stone. At night, when temperatures dropped, mist would have risen from the warm spring water, creating veils of vapor that caught moonlight. The stars overhead followed patterns that haven't changed. The same constellations wheeled through their courses, though Earth's axial precession meant different stars marked the pole. Vega served as North Star then, not Polaris. But the Milky Way still arched overhead, that river of light our ancestors mapped with the same wonder we bring to it now. When the warming accelerated around 9,000 BCE, the consequences unfolded slowly at first. Glacial melt fed into oceans, raising levels by millimeters per year, then centimeters. The Mediterranean rose in concert with global patterns. The change happened too gradually for a single lifetime to perceive. A beach that had seemed permanent would sit a meter farther inland after 50 years. The coastal plain began to shrink. River mouths that had carved valleys through the exposed shelf found themselves drowning, transforming from streams into estuaries. Springs that had bubbled up on dry land now emerged through increasingly shallow water, their freshwater plumes visible as distinct currents in the encroaching salt sea. Maybe the people noticed. Maybe they tracked high water marks on familiar stones, watching them creep upward generation by generation. Or perhaps the change felt too slow to matter, too dispersed across decades to register as crisis. The geological record preserves this transition in sediment cores. Layers of terrestrial soil give way to marine deposits, the boundary marking that moment when sea finally claimed land. Pollen analysis shows oak and pistachio declining, replaced by salt-tolerant species, then by nothing at all as water depth exceeded what sunlight could penetrate. By 8,000 years ago, the sea had risen approximately 25 meters from its lowest point. The coastal plain where communities had thrived sat beneath waves. Springs that had sustained settlements now flowed into salt water. Everything built there rested in blue-green silence, waiting for currents to cover them in protective sediment. And in that sediment, everything stopped changing. The transition that made Atlit Yam possible began roughly 12,000 years ago, when the Younger Dryas cold period released its grip on the Levant. Temperatures rose 2 to 3 degrees Celsius over the span of decades. Rapid change in geological terms, though still gradual enough that ecosystems adapted rather than collapsed. This warming period created conditions uniquely suited to the experiments and settlement that would define the next several millennia. Rainfall patterns shifted first. The Mediterranean received increased winter precipitation as storm tracks moved northward following retreating ice sheets. Annual rainfall in the coastal Levant rose from approximately 300 millimeters during the Younger Dryas to 500 or 600 millimeters by 10,000 BCE. This wasn't monsoon abundance, but it crossed a crucial threshold. Enough water to support perennial grasses, enough to make cultivation more reliable than foraging. The soil itself changed character. Increased rainfall meant more vegetation, which meant more organic matter breaking down into topsoil. The thin, rocky ground of the cold period deepened into terra rossa, that distinctive red-brown Mediterranean soil formed from limestone weathering. This soil held moisture better, supported root systems for wheat and barley. Perhaps the most important shift involved seasonality. The earlier climate had been not just cold, but erratic, with spring rains arriving unpredictably. The warming brought regularity. Winter rains from November through March, dry summers tempered by morning dew, springs that flowed reliably during the growing season. You could plan around this. You could commit to staying in one place because you knew water would be there. The landscape responded. Oak forests spread from isolated refugia, expanding across coastal plains and into valleys that had been too cold to support them. Wild wheat and barley grew in dense stands on hillsides. Animals followed the vegetation. Gazelle herds moved through seasonal patterns. Aurochs grazed the grasslands. Wild boar rooted through oak forests for acorns. Standing in this landscape 11,000 years ago, you would have seen abundance that earlier generations could barely imagine. The hardscrabble existence of the late Ice Age gave way to something approaching reliability. Not ease. Survival never came easy. But the land offered enough, consistently enough, that staying in one place started to make sense. The sky above reflected these changes too. Increased humidity meant more clouds, different patterns of morning and evening light. Sunrises would blaze orange through moisture-laden air. Stars appeared less crisp than in the clear skies of the Younger Dryas, but the same constellations marked the seasons. Leo rising with spring planting, Orion's belt pointing the way to summer. When humans began experimenting with cultivation around 10,500 BCE, they weren't inventing agriculture from nothing. They were responding to environmental conditions that made certain behaviors newly profitable. The wild cereals were there, growing thicker than before. The rainfall was there, arriving predictably. What they added was intention. The decision to save seeds, to clear competing plants, to stay put long enough to harvest what they'd planted. The archaeological evidence shows this transition clearly. Sites from the pre-pottery Neolithic A period contain wild grain processing tools, but little evidence of cultivation. Sites from the pre-pottery Neolithic B period show domesticated grain varieties, permanent structures, and specialized tools that only make sense for people who aren't moving seasonally. Atlit Yam belongs to this second phase. The people who built there inherited knowledge accumulated over millennia, which plants responded to cultivation, which animals tolerated proximity to human settlements, which stone tools worked best for specific tasks. They didn't pioneer farming, they perfected it in that window of climate stability between the Ice Age's end and the sea's encroachment. The warming that made their lives possible also doomed their settlement. The same melting ice that improved rainfall also fed the oceans. But that catastrophe lay generations in the future. For now, the climate offered warmth, water, soil, and time enough to build something worth remembering. The coastline where Atlit Yam emerged bore little resemblance to the modern Israeli shore. Instead of narrow beach and rapid depth drop-off, a broad coastal shelf extended several kilometers westward, creating a landscape of lagoons, wetlands, and river deltas. The shelf sloped gently. You could walk a full kilometer from the oak forest edge before water reached your waist. This wasn't a single beach, but a complex of environments. Freshwater streams carved small valleys as they descended from the Carmel Highlands, spreading into deltas where they met the sea. Between these deltas, low dunes formed and reformed with wind and tide. Some pools connected to the sea during winter storms, becoming brackish mixing zones. Others remained fresh year-round, fed by the same limestone aquifers that supplied the inland springs. The substrate varied dramatically over short distances. Limestone bedrock surfaced in some areas, creating platforms where shellfish colonized. Elsewhere, sand accumulated in thick deposits, forming beaches that would have felt familiar to anyone who's walked modern shores. River deltas deposited clay and silt, darker sediments rich in organic matter. Perhaps the most distinctive feature was the spring line, that geological boundary where the coastal aquifer met the surface. Springs emerged at regular intervals along this line, typically 500 to 800 meters apart, creating a string of freshwater sources that paralleled the shore. Each spring created its own microenvironment, pools of cool water surrounded by vegetation that thrived on reliable moisture. Standing at one of these springs on a summer morning 9,500 years ago, you would have felt multiple temperature zones. The spring water itself flowed at 16 to 18 degrees Celsius. Air temperature might reach 28 or 30 degrees by midday. The surrounding soil stayed cool, and the sea, visible a few hundred meters distant, showed surface temperatures around 24 degrees. The sounds created their own geography. Each spring had its characteristic voice. Some gurgled up through gravel, creating bubbly rhythms. Others flowed smoothly over limestone ledges. Wind through oak branches carried from inland. Waves broke on the distant shore, their rhythm changing with weather. Birds added their own layers, shorebirds calling along the beach, forest species singing from the oak groves. The stars wheeled overhead, following paths unchanged by these earthly details. Sirius rose before dawn in late summer. The Pleiades marked autumn's arrival. Orion dominated winter nights, his belt pointing toward the spring equinox position. These patterns governed more than navigation. They structured ritual, informed planting decisions, connected human activity to cycles larger than any individual life. When people first began settling along this coast, they chose locations with precise care. They needed fresh water, obviously. They needed sight lines for security. They needed access to multiple resource zones: the sea for fish, the forest for game, open areas for cultivation. The springs offered all of this within compact areas. The archaeological record shows settlement attempts stretching back to 10,000 BCE along this coast, though most were seasonal camps, rather than permanent villages. People would occupy a site during fishing season, then move inland during winter. The structures they built reflected this: temporary shelters of wood and reed, easily dismantled or abandoned. Something changed around 9,500 BCE. Settlements became permanent. Structures became more substantial. Foundations of stone, walls of mud brick, roofs designed to last years. Storage pits appeared, suggesting people were keeping surplus food through winter. The commitment to place became absolute. Maybe the climate stability convinced them. After millennia of unpredictable conditions, several generations of reliable rainfall might have felt like a permanent shift. Or perhaps population pressure left no choice. What's certain is that by the time Atlit Yam was established around 9,100 years ago, the pattern was set. People built to stay. They invested labor in structures that would outlast their builders. They arranged stones around springs for meaning, creating places that connected human community to water, to land, to whatever forces they believed governed existence. And the sea moved steadily toward everything they were building. The village emerged from sediment slowly, revealing itself piece by piece across decades of survey work. Marine archaeologists working the Israeli coast in the early 1980s were mapping ancient harbor installations when their sonar detected anomalous formations offshore from Atlit. The patterns suggested human modification rather than natural reef structures. Stone arrangements too regular, too geometric to form by chance. Initial dives in 1984 confirmed the suspicion. Ehud Galili, surveying the seabed at depths between 8 and 12 meters, found himself swimming over foundations. Not scattered rocks, but deliberate constructions. Walls formed rectangles measuring roughly 4 by 6 meters. Corners met at right angles. Some structures shared walls, suggesting planned community layout rather than random building. The preservation startled everyone involved. Wooden posts still stood upright in some foundations, their bases secured in stone sockets. These weren't fossilized or mineralized. They were actual wood, waterlogged, but structurally intact after 9,000 years. Cedar and oak, selected for their rot resistance, had survived because sediment covered them quickly after inundation, creating anaerobic conditions that prevented decay. What archaeologists found inside these structures told stories about daily existence. Storage pits contained animal bones, sheep, goat, pig, cattle, all domesticated species. Gazelle and deer bones appeared too, indicating continued hunting alongside animal husbandry. Fish bones clustered near hearths, suggesting meals consumed where they were prepared. The species mix revealed sophisticated resource use. Mediterranean fish for protein, shellfish for supplementary calories, land animals for major occasions. The artifacts scattered across the site numbered in thousands. Flint tools included sickle blades with characteristic polish from cutting grain stalks, scrapers for hide processing, points for hunting or fishing. Ground stone tools appeared in abundance. Mortars and pestles for grain processing, some still stained with residue, that later analysis identified as barley and wheat. Grinding stones showed wear patterns consistent with years of use. Perhaps the most remarkable finds were the organic materials. Rope made from twisted plant fibers, still holding its braid pattern. Woven baskets that had contained grain or gathered foods. Wooden bowls carved from single pieces of timber. These objects rarely survive in archaeological contexts. Their presence at Atlit Yam represents extraordinary preservation conditions. The human remains told their own story. Skeletons of men, women, and children buried in simple graves near the dwellings. Some showed evidence of hard physical labor, enlarged muscle attachments on arm and leg bones from repetitive, heavy work. Others revealed disease. Several individuals displayed lesions consistent with tuberculosis, making these the earliest confirmed cases of the disease in human skeletal remains. One skeleton showed damage particularly relevant to coastal living. The inner ear bones bore lesions characteristic of auditory exostosis, a condition caused by repeated exposure to cold water. Modern free divers develop identical damage from diving to depths of 10 meters or more. The evidence suggests this individual spent significant time underwater, probably harvesting shellfish or catching fish. The site's extent became clear through systematic survey. Approximately 40,000 square meters of seabed showed evidence of human occupation. The village wasn't small. Estimates suggest 200 to 600 residents at its peak, making it comparable in size to other pre-pottery Neolithic bee settlements across the Levant. But the most mysterious feature remained that stone semicircle. 7 megaliths, each weighing 600 kilograms or more, arranged in a careful curve around a freshwater spring. The discovery of this structure transformed understanding of the site from simple fishing village to something more complex, something that demanded explanation beyond basic subsistence. Ehud Galili descended through green water on a winter morning in 1984, following a survey grid that had become routine after weeks of mapping ancient harbor structures. The visibility reached maybe 8 meters that day, decent for the Israeli coast. Sediment hung suspended in the water column, catching sunlight in ways that made depth perception tricky. The sonar had indicated stone formations at this location, but sonar often missed context. Natural limestone outcrops created similar signatures to human construction. Galili expected reef, maybe scattered architectural fragments if he was lucky. What appeared beneath him as he reached the seabed made him pause mid-kick, hovering in neutral buoyancy while his brain processed what his eyes reported. Stones stood upright in a semicircle, not tumbled or scattered by currents, but positioned, arranged with clear intention. 7 of them, roughly 1.5 meters tall, their tops visible above the sediment that had accumulated around their bases. The spacing looked deliberate, approximately 1 meter between adjacent stones. And at the center of the arc, where you'd expect empty space, water shimmered differently. Temperature variation, or salinity, something creating optical distortion even underwater. Galili swam closer, running his gloved hand along the nearest megalith. Limestone, weathered by millennia of water flow, but showing tool marks near the base where sediment hadn't covered it. Chisel scars from shaping, from creating a relatively flat surface that could stand stable when set into substrate. This wasn't natural formation. Someone had moved these stones here, had positioned them with precision. The distortion at the center resolved as he approached. Fresh water flowing up through the seabed with enough pressure to create a visible plume. The spring was still active after all this time, still pushing water up through limestone aquifer despite 9 meters of seawater overhead. He could feel the temperature shift as he moved his hand through the flow, noticeably cooler than the surrounding sea. Swimming the perimeter, Galili noted how the stones faced inward toward the spring. Their arrangement wasn't quite a complete circle, more like a horseshoe open on one side. The opening faced east, toward where sunrise would have occurred when this stood on dry land. Maybe coincidence, maybe not. Other features emerged as he surveyed the surrounding area. Stone foundations visible through sediment, suggesting structures built near the spring. Piles of worked flint, too concentrated to be natural accumulation. And everywhere, pottery sherds. Wait, no, wrong period. Pre-pottery Neolithic wouldn't have ceramics, he corrected, himself noting the abundance of stone vessels instead. The discovery changed everything about the survey. What had been routine harbor mapping became archaeological priority. Galili surfaced, made notes on his slate, and began the process of documenting what would become one of the most important submerged Neolithic sites in the Mediterranean. Over the following months, systematic excavation revealed the full extent. Not just the stone circle, but an entire village preserved in sediment. Houses, tools, human remains, and that persistent mystery. Why arrange massive stones around a spring? What purpose justified the enormous labor investment? The questions multiplied faster than answers, which is often how archaeology works. You find something remarkable, and suddenly everything you thought you understood requires reconsideration. Dating the site required multiple methods, each providing different windows into chronology. Radiocarbon analysis of charcoal from hearths yielded dates, clustering around 6,900 to 6,300 BCE, placing occupation firmly in the pre-pottery Neolithic B period. Wood samples from structural posts confirmed this range, with most dates falling between 6,800 and 6,500 BCE. The stratigraphic sequence revealed occupation spanning several centuries. Sediment layers showed at least 3 major building phases, with structures rebuilt on the same foundations after collapse or renovation. Floor levels rose gradually, indicating accumulation of debris and intentional leveling for new construction. This wasn't a settlement occupied briefly and abandoned. People lived here across multiple generations. Pollen cores extracted from sediment provided environmental context. The layers contemporary with occupation showed oak, pistachio, and olive pollen in abundance, confirming the forested landscape suggested by other evidence. Above these layers, marine species appeared, marking the transition when rising seas claimed the site. The boundary sits sharp in the Ea core, terrestrial one layer, marine the next, preserving that moment of inundation. Perhaps the most detailed information came from the artifacts themselves. Stone tools showed technological consistency, typical of the pre-pottery Neolithic B period. Sickle blades used pressure flaking techniques that appeared around 7,000 BCE and continued for roughly a millennium. Projectile points match styles found at contemporary sites across the southern Levant. Beis Amun, Yiftahel, Hagoshrim. The groundstone assemblage revealed sophisticated understanding of material properties. Basalt mortars and pestles, imported from sources 30 kilometers inland, showed selection for hardness and weight. Limestone bowls carved with stone tools displayed precision work, walls thin to 5 millimeters in some cases. The investment of labor in these objects suggests they held value beyond simple utility. Analysis of bone remains provided insight into diet and health. Isotope studies on tooth enamel revealed these people consumed significant amounts of marine protein, perhaps 30 to 40% of their diet coming from fish and shellfish. This matched the faunal evidence. Fish bones dominated refuse deposits, with Mediterranean species like sea bream and grouper most common. The tuberculosis lesions found on several skeletons raised questions that persist today. How did the disease reach this population? TB typically spreads in crowded conditions, requiring sustained close contact between infected and susceptible individuals. The presence of the disease suggests population density sufficient for transmission, confirming that Atlit Yam represented substantial settlement rather than small camp. But certain mysteries resist resolution despite decades of study. The stone circle's purpose remains debated. Its alignment toward the sunrise suggests astronomical function, but the precision isn't sufficient to serve as accurate calendar. The spring's acoustic properties offer another explanation. Water flowing between standing stones creates resonance effects that might have held ritual significance. Both interpretations rest on reasonable evidence. Neither feels complete. Why did people invest such enormous effort moving 600-kilogram stones when smaller markers would have indicated the spring's location? What knowledge or belief system justified this labor? The archaeological record preserves the action, but not the motivation, leaving us to construct explanations from analogy and informed speculation. The answer sits somewhere in sediment, in arrangements we haven't fully decoded, in patterns we recognize but don't completely understand. And maybe that's appropriate. Not every question demands immediate resolution. Sometimes the wondering itself connects us to people who stood here 9,000 years ago, looking at these same stones, feeling something we can only approximate across the unbridgeable distance of time. Imagine walking through Atlit Yam on a spring morning around 6,700 BCE, when the settlement had reached its full extent. 40 or 50 rectangular houses clustered near the spring, their stone foundations supporting walls of mud, brick, and timber. Roofs of reed thatch sloped to shed winter rains. Smoke rose from morning cooking fires, carrying the scent of barley porridge seasoned with wild herbs. The houses followed consistent design, each measured roughly 4 by 6 meters internally, large enough for a family of 5 or 6. Stone platforms along one wall served as sleeping areas, raised above packed earth floors to avoid dampness. Hearths occupied central positions, their placement calculated to allow smoke to escape through roof openings while maintaining warmth during cold months. Storage dominated the interior organization. Plastered pits sunk into floors held grain harvested in previous seasons, sealed against moisture and pests. Stone-lined compartments contained dried fish, preserved through salting or smoking. Woven baskets, hung from roof beams, keeping gathered foods away from rodents. The archaeological evidence suggests most households maintained surplus supplies sufficient for several months. The social structure appears relatively egalitarian based on housing uniformity. No structures stand significantly larger than others. No concentrations of prestige goods in particular dwellings. Wealth differences existed, certainly, but the architectural record doesn't show the dramatic stratification visible at some contemporary sites. Perhaps the shared challenge of coastal living enforced cooperation over competition. Daily routines followed seasonal patterns. Winter months meant maintenance and craft production, tool making, basket weaving, repair of damaged structures. The weather often kept people close to hearths, working on tasks that could be accomplished indoors. Spring brought planting in fields cleared from oak forest, barley and wheat sown to catch the last winter rains before summer drought. Summer required intense labor, harvesting grain, processing catches from increased fishing activity, gathering wild plants that ripened during warm months. The archaeological bone evidence shows people consumed significant quantities of almonds and pistachios, both abundant in the surrounding landscape during summer. These provided fat and protein that complemented grain-heavy diets. Autumn marked the diving season. Water temperatures moderated after summer heat, improving visibility and comfort for extended underwater work. The ear damage found on several skeletons suggests individuals specialized in this work, diving repeatedly to depths of 10 meters or more. They harvested shellfish and pursued fish species that sheltered in rocky crevices. Tool production showed remarkable sophistication. Flint knappers created sickle blades using pressure flaking techniques that produced sharp, durable edges. The characteristic sheen on these tools comes from silica in plant stems, polishing the stone through repeated cutting. Some blades show hafting traces, residue from the mastic used to secure them in wooden or bone handles. Ground stone technology reached impressive levels. Basalt mortars were shaped through pecking, a process requiring hundreds of hours to create vessels 30 centimeters across and 15 centimeters deep. The interiors show smooth wear from grinding grain mixed with the stone itself, creating natural non-stick surfaces. Limestone bowls carved with stone tools display walls thinned to remarkable delicacy, some measuring just 5 millimeters thick. At night, when work ceased and families gathered around hearths, the stars wheeled overhead in patterns that governed more than timekeeping. The Pleiades rising signaled planting season. Orion's appearance marked winter's approach. These weren't abstract observations, but practical knowledge encoded in sky watching, passed from generation to generation through stories and instruction. The village thrived for perhaps 300 years, adapting to gradual environmental changes, maintaining traditions while incorporating new techniques. But beneath this stability, forces beyond human control were shifting. The sea crept closer, millimeter by millimeter. And in the arrangement of stones around the spring, in the precision of their placement, lay meanings we're only beginning to decode. The spring's megaliths didn't arrive by accident or divine intervention. Someone organized their placement, directed the labor, understood the engineering required to move 600-kilogram stones across uneven terrain. Picture the planning phase. The stones themselves likely came from limestone outcrops 200 to 300 meters inland, where weathering had created natural blocks of appropriate size. Workers would have assessed each stone for weight distribution, looking for pieces that could be moved without splitting. 7 stones required, each roughly 1 to 1.5 meters tall, shaped enough to stand stable when planted in substrate. The hay transport method probably involved wooden rollers and leather ropes, technology available to pre-pottery Neolithic bee communities. Archaeological evidence from contemporary sites shows they understood lever principles and could construct simple machines for heavy lifting. Moving one stone the required distance would have occupied a work crew of 15 to 20 people for most of a day. Positioning demanded precision, the archaeological record clearly demonstrates. The stones form a semicircle with remarkably consistent spacing, approximately 1 meter between adjacent megaliths. This wasn't approximate arrangement, but careful measurement, suggesting they used standardized units, perhaps arm spans or rope lengths marked at intervals. The arc opens toward the east, though whether this held astronomical significance or simply provided access remains uncertain. The spring complicated everything. Workers couldn't simply dig holes and drop stones in place. They needed to account for water flow, for the soft sediment around the spring's outlet. The solution appears to have involved creating stone platforms beneath each megalith, distributing weight across broader areas to prevent sinking. Underwater excavation revealed these platforms, constructed from smaller stones fitted together to create stable bases. Imagine the final placement. A crew positions the last stone, adjusting its angle to match the others, stepping back to assess the completed work. The spring flows between the standing stones now, its water catching sunlight, creating patterns of light and shadow that shift through the day. Whatever they intended, whatever meaning this arrangement held, they achieved it through coordinated labor and shared vision. The acoustic properties became apparent immediately. Water flowing between stones created resonance, amplifying certain frequencies while dampening others. Modern acoustic analysis shows the configuration acts as a natural filter, enhancing sounds in the 80 to 120 Hz range while suppressing higher frequencies. Human voices speaking or chanting within the circle would have been noticeably altered, given qualities different from ordinary speech. Did they discover this by accident or design it intentionally? The archaeological evidence can't answer definitively. What's certain is that once constructed, the stone circle became a focal point for community activity. The density of artifacts near the structure suggests frequent use, repeated gatherings that left material traces archaeologists could map millennia later. The effort invested reveals something about values beyond simple survival. These people possess the technical capability and social organization to move stones weighing more than half a ton, arranging them in precise configurations. They chose to do this, prioritizing this work over other possible uses of labor. What belief or knowledge justified this choice? The answer matters less than recognizing the impulse itself. The human need to mark significant places, to create structures that speak to something beyond immediate utility. Daily life at Atlit Yam moved in rhythms dictated by tide, season, and the reliable flow of fresh water from limestone depths. The spring provided more than drinking water. It structured social patterns, drew people together for tasks requiring abundant water, created a gathering point where information and goods exchanged hands. Morning saw the first water collection. Women and older children typically performed this work, carrying ceramic vessels. Stone and woven containers to the spring. The containers themselves reveal sophisticated craft knowledge. Waterproof baskets woven from plant fibers, sealed with natural resins. Stone bowls carved thin enough to carry easily, yet strong enough to withstand daily use. The spring's temperature stayed constant year-round at 16 to 18 degrees Celsius. In summer heat, when air temperatures reached 30 degrees or higher, the cool water offered relief beyond mere hydration. People would wade into the pool surrounding the spring's outlet, letting the temperature ease the day's accumulated warmth. In winter, the relatively warm water created microclimates where certain activities became more comfortable. Fishing occupied significant labor throughout the year. The bone evidence shows Mediterranean species dominated catches: sea bream, grouper, mullet. These fish required different capture methods. Some responded to hook and line, technology the settlement clearly possessed based on bone fishhook discoveries. Others required nets or traps, indicated by stone net weights found across the site. The specialized divers pursued a different strategy. Diving to depths of 10 meters or more, they harvested shellfish and caught fish that sheltered in rock crevices. the physiological cost shows in skeletal remains. The ear damage, the enlarged chest cavities from breath-holding practice. But the caloric return justified the physical toll. Shellfish provided reliable protein with minimal equipment investment. Agriculture followed Mediterranean patterns still visible today. Winter rains supported grain crops planted in autumn. Barley dominated based on charred seed evidence, with wheat playing a secondary role. The fields probably occupied cleared areas within the oak forest, patches where trees had been removed and stumps grubbed out to create arable land. Harvest occurred in late spring, before summer drought stressed the ripening grain. Sickle blades show heavy use wear during these weeks, indicating intensive cutting, followed by threshing and winnowing. The grain required protection from moisture and pests, explaining the elaborate storage pit construction found in most dwellings. Animal husbandry supplemented wild resources. Sheep and goats grazed on vegetation unsuitable for cultivation, converting plant matter humans couldn't digest into meat, milk, and eventually wool or hair textile production. Pigs consumed food scraps and foraged in areas near the settlement. Cattle, requiring more intensive management, appeared in smaller numbers, but provided significant meat yields when slaughtered. At night, after the day's labor concluded, people gathered near hearths. The stone circle may have served as gathering place during certain seasons or occasions, its acoustic properties lending ceremony to communal events. Or perhaps it remained primarily sacred space, approached only during specific rituals we can no longer reconstruct. The stars overhead marked time's passage in ways both practical and profound. Sailors and fishermen navigated by stellar positions. Farmers planned planting by celestial calendars. But beyond utility, the wheeling constellations connected human activity to larger patterns, to cycles that predated any individual life and would continue long after. The village's prosperity rested on this integration of resources, sea and land, wild and domesticated individual labor and communal effort. For 300 years, the pattern held, adapting to minor fluctuations but maintaining essential continuity. Yet beneath this stability, the sea rose steadily, claiming a few centimeters of shoreline each generation. Eventually, inevitably, the water would reach the spring itself. Certain skills at Atlit Yam required years to master. Knowledge passed through apprenticeship and observation, rather than written instruction. The flint knappers who produced those polished sickle blades learned their craft through extended practice, accumulating understanding of how stone fractures, how pressure applied at precise angles produces predictable results. The quality of tools shows this expertise clearly. Pressure flaking creates controlled removals, shaping stone with precision impossible through simple percussion. The technique requires understanding material properties, how different flint types respond to pressure, where natural flaws will cause unwanted breaks, when to heat treat stone to improve workability. These weren't casual skills, but specialized knowledge held by individuals who invested significant portions of their lives in mastery. Groundstone production demanded different expertise. Shaping basalt mortars through pecking required patience measured in weeks or months. The process involved repeated striking with harder stone, gradually removing material to create the desired form. Efficiency came from experience, knowing where to strike, how hard, at what angles to achieve smooth curves and even walls. The limestone bowl carvers possessed perhaps the most remarkable technical ability. Creating vessels with 5 mm walls from solid stone using only stone tools represents extraordinary control. The work required understanding stone grain, recognizing stress points that might cause splitting, maintaining even pressure through hours of careful abrasion. These objects weren't utilitarian necessities, but demonstrations of skill, possibly traded or gifted as valuable goods. Diving knowledge passed through different channels. The physical techniques, breath holding, pressure equalization, efficient swimming, came through practice and observation. But the knowledge of where to dive, when conditions favored particular harvests, which rocks sheltered desired species, accumulated across generations. This represented cultural capital, information that separated successful divers from those who merely possessed physical capability. Astronomical knowledge structured agricultural and ritual calendars. Someone needed to track stellar positions, recognize the annual patterns, translate celestial observations into practical timing for planting and harvest. The precision wasn't scientific in modern terms, but it worked reliably across years and generations. Perhaps the spring circle embodied this accumulated knowledge in stone form. The astronomical alignment, the acoustic properties, the precise spacing. These features suggest understanding that went beyond trial and error. Someone conceived the design, understood what arrangement would produce desired results, directed construction to achieve specific ends. What other knowledge existed that left no archaeological trace? Stories and songs, certainly. Healing practices using plants that don't preserve in sediment. Social protocols governing everything from marriage to dispute resolution. The material record captures only fragments, the durable remnants of rich cultural systems. The stars witnessed all of it. The slow accumulation of expertise, the transmission across generations, the individual moments of discovery or innovation. Sirius rising before dawn marked the same seasonal transition for these people as it had for their ancestors and would for their descendants. The constellations wheeled through patterns unchanged by human activity, indifferent observers of civilizations that rise and fade. But hidden, within the village's apparent stability, within the successful integration of knowledge and resource, lay dimensions we're only now beginning to perceive. The stone circle held meanings beyond the obvious. The spring's properties suggested connections to forces larger than local geography. And beneath everything, the slowly rising sea approached its inevitable claim. Beneath the obvious function of freshwater supply, the spring at Atlet Yam Center held properties that suggest intentional acoustic design. Modern analysis reveals the stone semicircle creates specific resonance effects, amplifying frequencies between 80 and 120 Hz, while dampening sounds above 500 Hz. This range corresponds to fundamental frequencies of human speech and chanting, enhancing vocal communication within the circle while filtering environmental noise. The acoustic phenomenon wasn't accidental. The spacing between megaliths, the curve of their arrangement, the spring's position at the focal point, these elements combine to create what acousticians call a resonant chamber. Sound waves bounce between the standing stones, reinforcing certain frequencies through constructive interference. Water flowing through the configuration adds another layer, generating white noise that masks external sounds, while the stone geometry preserves internal acoustics. Did the builders understand this physics? Perhaps not in modern terms, but the evidence suggests empirical knowledge. They could have tested different arrangements, listened to how sound behaved in various configurations, adjusted spacing and position until achieving desired results. The precision of the final layout indicates purposeful design rather than fortunate accident. What rituals or practices utilize these acoustic properties? The archaeological record offers no direct answers, only suggestive traces. The density of artifacts near the circle, the apparent gathering area surrounding it, the careful maintenance evident in successive occupation layers, all point to regular use beyond casual water collection. Maybe ceremonial chanting, the human voice altered by stone resonance, became part of community rituals marking seasons or life transitions. Hidden within the spring's constant flow lies another mystery. The water emerges at 16 to 18 degrees Celsius, regardless of season or sea temperature. This thermal stability indicates deep aquifer sources, water that has traveled through limestone for years or decades before surfacing. The ancient builders would have recognized this constancy, the way the spring maintained temperature when everything else fluctuated. Perhaps they attributed spiritual significance to this reliability. In a world where most phenomena varied unpredictably, where droughts could destroy crops and storms could scatter fishing fleets, the spring's unwavering character might have seemed supernatural. A connection to forces beneath the earth, to waters that flowed through darkness and emerged unchanged. The astronomical alignment adds another dimension. The semicircle opens toward the east, where sunrise occurs throughout the year. But the precise orientation, measured by archaeologists using the standing stone's positions, suggests specific attention to equinox sunrise. On those 2 days annually when day and night balance perfectly, the sun rises directly through the circle's opening, its first light striking the spring's surface. Some scholars interpret this as calendrical function, a way to mark agricultural timing without written records or complex calculation. Others see ritual significance, moments when celestial and terrestrial waters aligned, when the sky's fire touched the earth's spring. Both interpretations rest on solid reasoning. Both reveal something true about human impulses toward meaning-making. Modern geophysical surveys have revealed still more hidden features. Ground-penetrating radar and sonar mapping show stone platforms beneath each megalith, foundations that distributed weight across soft sediment near the spring's outlet. The engineering knowledge required to prevent these massive stones from sinking or tilting demonstrates sophisticated understanding of substrate and structural stability. Beneath the visible archaeology lies a pattern of intentional design that integrated acoustic properties, thermal stability, astronomical alignment, and structural engineering. Whether this integration followed master plan or evolved through successive improvements remains uncertain. What's clear is that the final configuration served multiple purposes simultaneously, addressing practical needs while creating space for activities we can only approximate. The silence now covering the site preserves these mysteries in sediment and salt water. The stones stand where they were placed, still marking the spring that still flows, waiting for patient observation to reveal what knowledge moved through the hands that positioned them 9 millennia ago. Hidden in marine sediment, organic materials survived that normally decay within years of burial. The anaerobic conditions created when seawater and silt-covered atlet yam transformed the site into a time capsule, preserving rope, wood, seeds, and human remains in extraordinary detail. This preservation reveals dimensions of Neolithic life invisible at terrestrial sites. The rope fragments show sophisticated fiber technology. Plant materials, probably flax or hemp, were processed to extract fibers, then twisted into cord using techniques still recognizable today. Some rope shows 3-ply construction, individual strands twisted in one direction, then combined with opposite twist to prevent unraveling. The knowledge required to produce durable cordage from raw plant material represents accumulated expertise passed through generations. Wooden artifacts provide equally remarkable insights. Bowls carved from single pieces of timber, their interiors smoothed through, patient abrasion with sand and stone, tool handles shaped to fit human hands, wear patterns showing where fingers gripped during use. Structural posts that still stand upright in foundation sockets, their wood waterlogged but intact enough for species identification and dendrochronological analysis. Perhaps the most revealing preserved materials are the seeds and grain remnants. Analysis identifies domesticated barley and wheat varieties, showing genetic changes from wild ancestors. The domestication process involved selecting seeds from plants with desirable traits, larger kernels, non-shattering seed heads, predictable germination. These characteristics don't arise spontaneously, but accumulate through intentional human selection across many generations. The human remains themselves preserve details invisible in dry site skeletons. Soft tissue occasionally survived initial burial, leaving traces archaeologists can analyze for diet and disease beyond what bone chemistry reveals. The tuberculosis lesions visible on several individuals represent just one discovery. Ongoing analysis continues finding new indicators of health conditions, stress patterns, even genetic relationships between buried individuals. Beneath the scientific data lies something harder to quantify, but equally significant. These preservation conditions allow us to touch objects last handled 9,000 years ago, to see tool marks from stone implements, to hold rope twisted by hands that never imagined their work would survive into an era unimaginable to them. What other secrets remain hidden in unexcavated areas? Marine archaeology proceeds slowly, constrained by diving limitations, conservation requirements, and the simple challenge of working underwater. Systematic survey has covered perhaps 30% of the site's full extent. The remaining 70% waits beneath sediment, holding artifacts and structures yet to be discovered. Alternative interpretations of the site continue emerging as new evidence surfaces. Some researchers emphasize Atlet Yam's role in regional trade networks, pointing to obsidian tools sourced from Anatolia and basalt from inland volcanic regions. Others focus on ritual aspects, the spring circle's apparent ceremonial function. Neither view excludes the other. Complex societies serve multiple purposes simultaneously, integrating economic, social, and spiritual dimensions. The mystery of abandonment remains unresolved despite extensive study. Rising sea levels clearly played a role, but the timeline isn't precisely certain. Did people leave gradually as water encroached, or did some catastrophic event force sudden departure? The archaeological record shows no evidence of violence or destruction, suggesting planned withdrawal rather than panic. But exactly when and why they made that final decision to abandon homes maintained across generations. This knowledge rests somewhere in sediment layers not yet excavated or analyzed. Modern technology continues revealing hidden features. Multi-beam sonar creates three-dimensional maps of the seabed, showing structural relationships invisible to divers working at individual locations. Underwater photogrammetry produces detailed models of artifacts in situ, preserving context before excavation. Each technological advance uncovers dimensions previously inaccessible, adding complexity to understanding while raising new questions. The stillness of the submerged site preserves not just artifacts, but the potential for future discovery. patient observation, careful methodology, and willingness to revise interpretation as new evidence emerges. These approaches slowly illuminate what remains hidden in blue-green depths. After decades of research, certain aspects of Atlit Yam resist definitive explanation, maintaining mystery despite scientific investigation. The stone circle's complete purpose remains elusive, acknowledged by archaeologists who present multiple interpretations without claiming conclusive resolution. This uncertainty isn't failure. It reflects honest engagement with evidence that supports several equally plausible explanations. The acoustic properties seem deliberate, but were they primary purpose or fortunate byproduct? The astronomical alignment appears intentional, but did it serve calendrical function or ritual significance? The spring's thermal stability clearly mattered, but how did this factor into the circle's design? Each question has reasonable answers that don't quite satisfy completely. Some researchers propose the circle served as community gathering space, a location where acoustic enhancement facilitated group communication. The arrangement would allow speakers positioned near the spring to be heard clearly by listeners arranged around the semicircle's arc, with the stone geometry projecting voice while filtering environmental noise. This interpretation emphasizes practical function over symbolic meaning. Others suggest ritual, purpose as primary, with the circle marking sacred space where ceremonies connected community to forces greater than human scale. The spring's constant flow, unchanging temperature, and position at the configuration center might have represented eternal continuity amid temporal change. The astronomical alignment then becomes portal, moments when celestial and terrestrial realms touched, when ordinary space transformed into ceremonial ground. Perhaps the debate itself misconstrues the question. Modern thinking often separates practical from symbolic, utility from meaning, as if these occupied different categories. But for pre-pottery Neolithic communities, such distinctions might not have existed. A gathering space could simultaneously serve acoustic communication, ritual practice, astronomical observation, and spiritual connection without conflict or contradiction. The abandonment sequence raises equally persistent questions. Rising sea levels eventually made the site uninhabitable, but determining exactly when people left requires precision. The archaeological record doesn't quite provide. Radiocarbon dates cluster between 6,900 and 6,300 BCE, but the latest occupation phase shows dating uncertainty of plus or minus 100 years. Did final abandonment occur around 6,400 BCE or closer to 6,200 BCE? This 200-year range matters when trying to correlate abandonment with sea level curves. What did people do with portable valuables before leaving? The artifact assemblage shows everyday items, tools, storage vessels, animal bones. But precious objects, if they existed, don't appear in excavated areas. Perhaps they were carried away. Perhaps precious, as we understand it, didn't apply to their value system. Or perhaps such items remain in unexcavated portions of the site. Hidden beneath methodological questions lies deeper mystery about consciousness and meaning. What did the people who built the stone circle believe about their world? How did they conceptualize the relationship between human community and natural forces? What stories did they tell about the spring's origin, its constant flow, its cool waters emerging from unseen depths? The archaeological record preserves actions and their material consequences. Stones moved and positioned, structures built and maintained, tools made and used. But the beliefs, stories, Songs and philosophical frameworks that gave meaning to these actions vanished with the last speaker of their language. We reconstruct behaviors, but can only approximate motivations. Some scholars argue this limitation represents archaeology's greatest challenge and greatest opportunity. We can't know with certainty what ancient people thought or felt, but the effort to understand connects us across time in ways purely technical analysis cannot. The questions themselves become bridges, linking our wonder to theirs across 9 millennia. The stars that wheeled above Atlat Yam wheel above us still, following patterns unchanged, despite everything human civilization has accomplished or destroyed. The spring flows beneath Mediterranean waters, its temperature constant, its source mysterious, waiting for patient investigation to reveal more of what it holds. And in that waiting, in that acknowledgement of limits to current understanding, rests space for future discovery and the humility that genuine inquiry requires. Why did they build the stone circle? This question has occupied researchers since Ehud Galili first documented the megalithic configuration in 1984, generating interpretations that span from purely practical to deeply symbolic. Each perspective offers insights worth considering. Each rests on evidence that resists easy dismissal. Some scholars emphasize the circle's acoustic properties as primary purpose. The stone arrangement creates measurable resonance effects, amplifying human voice frequencies while dampening environmental noise. This interpretation suggests the builders understood sound, behavior empirically, testing configurations until achieving desired acoustic performance. The circle then served as gathering space where community could assemble for discussion, dispute resolution, or collective decision-making with enhanced communication clarity. Others point to astronomical alignment as key feature. The semicircle opens precisely toward equinox sunrise, suggesting calendrical function. In agricultural societies dependent on timing planting and harvest correctly, marking seasonal transitions held crucial practical importance. Perhaps the circle served as observatory, a place where designated individuals tracked solar positions and announced appropriate dates for community activities. A few researchers propose ritual interpretation, seeing the spring circle as sacred space where ceremonies connected human community to forces beyond ordinary perception. The water's constant flow, unchanging temperature, and emergence from unseen depths might have represented eternal continuity, a manifestation of powers governing existence. The stone arrangement then marked this sacred character, creating boundary between ordinary and consecrated ground. Maybe the question itself creates false dichotomy. Modern thinking tends to separate practical from symbolic, utility from meaning, as if these occupy distinct categories. But pre-pottery Neolithic communities might not have recognized such divisions. A space could simultaneously serve acoustic communication, astronomical observation, water collection, and ritual practice without contradiction. The circle's multiple functions might have reinforced rather than competed with each other. The abandonment sequence raises equally challenging questions. Rising sea levels eventually claimed the site, but exactly when and how people responded remains uncertain. Some evidence suggests gradual withdrawal, occupation layers showing decreasing artifact density in later phases, possibly indicating reduced population as water encroached. This interpretation envisions people slowly relocating inland as their settlement became increasingly vulnerable. Other researchers note the lack of clear abandonment indicators. No scattered belongings suggesting hasty departure. No evidence of flooding damage in structural remains. Perhaps people left in organized fashion, carrying portable possessions and carefully closing a chapter of community history. The final residents might have known they were leaving permanently, taking time to decide what to carry and what to leave behind. A third possibility suggests catastrophic event forced sudden departure. A tsunami generated by distant earthquake or underwater landslide could have flooded the coastal plain rapidly, giving little warning. However, the geological record shows no definitive tsunami deposits from this period, making this scenario speculative rather than evidence-based. We may never know with certainty what prompted final abandonment or how it unfolded. The archaeological record preserves material consequences, but not human deliberations, decisions, or emotional responses. Did the last person to leave the village look back at the stone circle, understanding they would never return? Did they feel loss, relief, resignation? These questions transcend what artifacts can answer. The connection to other submerged sites across the Mediterranean suggests broader patterns worth considering. Atlit Yam represents just one example of coastal settlements claimed by rising seas during the early Holocene. Similar sites exist off the coasts of Greece, Turkey, and North Africa, though few show Atlit Yam's exceptional preservation. Perhaps these underwater villages collectively represent a lost chapter of Mediterranean prehistory, communities that thrived during the narrow window between ice age and inundation. What knowledge disappeared with them? Technologies, practices, beliefs. Entire cultural systems might have vanished beneath the waves, leaving only scattered material traces. The survivors who relocated inland carried what they could, but surely some understanding died with abandoned places, lost when the last generation with direct memory passed away. The patience required to engage these questions honestly mirrors the patience required to excavate underwater sites. Rushing toward definitive answers risks overlooking nuance, ignoring evidence that doesn't fit preferred interpretations. Better to sit with uncertainty, to acknowledge multiple possibilities, to remain open to revision as new discoveries emerge. Perhaps the stone circle's greatest significance lies not in what we can prove, but in what it continues to suggest. Possibilities that hover at the edge of evidence, interpretations that feel plausible without becoming certain. This state of informed uncertainty connects us to the builders in unexpected ways, reminding us that meaning often exceeds material traces. Consider the spring's symbolic potential. Water, emerging from depths, flowing constantly, maintaining temperature while everything else fluctuated. These properties would have seemed remarkable to people whose survival depended on reading natural patterns. Some scholars suggest the spring represented connection to underworld, to realm beneath ordinary perception where forces governing surface existence originated. The stone circle then marked portal, a place where boundaries between visible and invisible thinned. Others imagine the spring as life source in more direct sense. Water sustains all living things, making reliable freshwater sources literally vital to community survival. Perhaps the circle's construction expressed gratitude, a monumental acknowledgement of dependence on forces beyond human control. The labor invested in moving and positioning stones then becomes offering, sacrifice of time and effort to honor what sustained them. Maybe both interpretations capture partial truth. Practical gratitude and symbolic meaning need not exclude each other. The people who built there might have understood the spring as simultaneously utilitarian resource and sacred manifestation, finding no contradiction in this dual nature. The astronomical alignment invites similar speculation. Beyond calendrical utility, the equinox sunrise might have held cosmological significance. Those 2 days annually when daylight and darkness balanced perfectly, when the sun rose directly through the circle's opening to strike the spring's surface. Perhaps these moments represented cosmic order made visible, a demonstration that regularity governed chaos. We may never recover the specific beliefs that motivated construction, but patterns across cultures suggest certain themes appear repeatedly in human responses to mystery. Sacred springs appear in traditions worldwide, from Celtic holy wells to Hindu tirtha sites to Native American water ceremonies. The impulse to mark and honor reliable water sources seems nearly universal, transcending specific cultural contexts. Similarly, stone circles built around natural features occur across geographic and temporal range. Stonehenge in Britain, Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, medicine wheels in North America, each represents unique cultural expression, yet all share this pattern of arranging stones in circular configuration around or near significant landscape features. Perhaps this reflects something fundamental about human spatial cognition, the way we organize meaning in physical space. The Atlit Yam circle participates in these broader patterns while maintaining its specific character. Comparing it to other sites illuminates commonalities without erasing distinctiveness. The challenge lies in finding appropriate balance, recognizing universal human tendencies while honoring particular cultural expressions. Some mysteries may resist solution not because evidence is lacking, but because the questions themselves assume perspectives alien to the builders. We ask about purpose as if each structure served single function, as if practical and symbolic occupied separate categories, as if meaning could be extracted and stated definitively. But perhaps the circle's significance lay precisely in its multiplicity, its capacity to serve different purposes for different people at different times. The silence surrounding the submerged site preserves these possibilities. The stones stand where they were positioned, marking the spring that still flows, holding whatever significance we bring to observation. Modern divers swimming between the megaliths encounter the same acoustic effects ancient builders created, hearing their own voices altered by stone geometry. In those moments, perhaps the gap between past and present narrows, though never quite closing. What we gain from engaging these questions honestly might matter more than reaching definitive answers. The process of considering multiple interpretations, weighing evidence, acknowledging limits to current understanding, this builds intellectual humility and appreciation for complexity. The mystery itself becomes teacher, instructing us in the patience genuine inquiry requires. The stars that wheeled above the builders wheel above us still, indifferent to human efforts at meaning-making, yet somehow essential to those efforts. We look up seeking patterns, finding significance in celestial configurations, much as people did 9 millennia ago. The urge to connect terrestrial existence to cosmic order persists across time, manifesting in endlessly varied forms but expressing consistent human need for orientation in vast universe. And in acknowledging what we cannot know, in sitting comfortably with uncertainty, we honor the complexity of past lives lived in earnest under those same stars. The village disappeared beneath waves around 6,300 BCE, its stone circle and careful arrangements claimed by the same rising seas that would eventually stabilize at modern levels. For millennia, the site rested in darkness, covered by sediment that preserved what it buried. The people who built there relocated inland, carrying portable possessions and accumulated knowledge, but leaving behind structures too massive to transport. What memory survived the abandonment? Oral traditions might have preserved stories of the coastal settlement for generations, describing the spring circle and explaining its significance to descendants who never saw it. But oral memory fades eventually, distorted through retelling, until original events become unrecognizable or forgotten entirely. Without writing to anchor details, the specific history of Atlit Yam likely dissolved into general memory of ancestors who lived differently in places claimed by water. The physical site remained unknown and untouched except by currents and marine life. Fish swam through doorways of houses built 9 millennia earlier. Sediment accumulated in storage pits that once held grain. The megaliths stood in their semicircle, water still flowing around them as it had when the structure served whatever purpose its builders intended. Time passed in underwater silence while surface civilizations rose and fell, each leaving their own archaeological signatures for future discovery. Modern rediscovery began with systematic coastal survey work in the 1960s, when Israeli archaeologists started documenting submerged structures along the Mediterranean shore. The initial findings focused on later periods: Roman harbors, Byzantine installations, Crusader fortifications. The older materials went unnoticed at first, dismissed as natural formations or considered too fragmentary for meaningful interpretation. Ehud Galili's 1984 discovery changed everything. His recognition that the stone arrangements represented Neolithic construction rather than later modifications transformed understanding of the area's prehistoric occupation. Suddenly, researchers realized they were looking at one of the earliest farming communities in the southern Levant, preserved in extraordinary condition by the same inundation that destroyed it. The decades following discovery brought systematic excavation and analysis. Each diving season revealed new details: artifact assemblages, skeletal remains, structural configurations. Specialized techniques developed for underwater archaeology allowed researchers to document context as carefully as terrestrial excavations. Though working at 8 to 12 meters depth while managing limited bottom time presented ongoing challenges. Even now, research continues at Atlit Yam. Modern technologies enable investigations impossible during initial excavation phases. Ground-penetrating radar maps buried features without disturbing sediment. Underwater photogrammetry creates three-dimensional models preserving spatial relationships. DNA analysis of human remains reveals genetic connections to other pre-pottery Neolithic populations, tracing migration patterns and social networks across the ancient Levant. Still today, the spring flows beneath Mediterranean waters, its temperature constant at 16 to 18 degrees Celsius. Its source deep within limestone, aquifer unchanged by millennia of surface transformation. Divers visiting the site can position themselves within the stone circle, experiencing the acoustic properties ancient builders created, hearing how sound behaves in the configuration they designed. The connection across time becomes tangible in those moments, though necessarily incomplete. The pattern of submergence and rediscovery repeats across the Mediterranean. Dozens of sites rest beneath coastal waters, settlements built during lower sea levels and claimed by rising oceans. Each represents a chapter of human history temporarily forgotten, waiting for technology and curiosity to reveal them again. The cycle of remembering and forgetting seems fundamental to how knowledge persists, or doesn't, across civilizational changes. What Atlit Yam teaches us extends beyond specific archaeological details. The site demonstrates that rising sea levels represent not abstract future threat, but historical reality that has reshaped coastlines repeatedly. The people who built there adapted to gradual environmental change for generations before eventually relocating. Their experience offers perspective on our own era of climate transformation, though the analogy has limits given vastly different technological and social contexts. The legacy lives in continued investigation, in questions that multiply faster than answers, in the persistent mystery of the stone circle's complete purpose. Each generation of researchers brings new methods and perspectives, finding patterns previous scholars missed or asking questions earlier investigators never considered. The site becomes conversation across time, connecting ancient builders to modern observers through shared attention to the same stones, the same spring, the same Mediterranean waters. And perhaps the legacy lives in you now, listening to this exploration, carrying forward some fragment of attention to people who arrange stones with care 9,000 years ago. The story continues as long as someone remembers, as long as the questions matter to minds willing to engage them. The stones stand waiting, the spring flows constant, and the stars wheel overhead in patterns unchanged by everything human civilization has accomplished or forgotten. The stone circle rests beneath blue-green water, sediment soft around the megalith's bases, currents moving gently through the configuration. Light filters down from the surface, creating patterns that shift with waves passing overhead. The spring flows as it has for millennia, water emerging from depths at temperature that never varies, mixing with salt sea in plumes divers can trace. Above the water, night falls over the modern Israeli coast. The same stars that guided ancient mariners shine with light that left those distant suns years or centuries ago, crossing space to reach eyes that won't remember what they witnessed. Sirius rises before dawn, brilliant against the lightening eastern sky. The Pleiades cluster toward the western horizon. Orion has already set, following his eternal path beneath the earth to rise again tomorrow. Somewhere inland from the submerged village, in cities built with technologies unimaginable to Neolithic farmers, people sleep in beds with mattresses and climate control, dreaming dreams as unknowable to us as the thoughts of people who position those stones. The distance separating us from them measures not just time, but entire transformations of how humans organize existence. Yet, something connects across that gap. The same impulse to mark significant places, to invest meaning in arrangements of matter, to look up at stars seeking orientation. The mystery endures not because evidence is lacking, but because some questions exceed what artifacts can answer. We know what they built when they built it, how they arranged the stones. We measure acoustic properties and astronomical alignments with precision their builders might find baffling or irrelevant. But why they chose this particular configuration, what it meant to stand within that circle at equinox sunrise, what stories they told about the spring's constant flow. These remain in the realm of informed imagination, speculation grounded in evidence, but never quite achieving certainty. Maybe that's appropriate. Maybe the stone circle's greatest gift is the space it opens for wonder, the invitation to engage questions that resist final resolution. In our era of searchable information and instant answers, mysteries that persist despite investigation offer different kind of value. They teach patience, intellectual humility, appreciation for complexity that exceeds simple explanation. The Mediterranean moves in rhythms older than human memory, tides responding to lunar pull, unchanged since the moon first orbited Earth. The water that claimed Athlete Yam continues its endless circulation, evaporating under summer sun, condensing in winter storms, falling as rain on highlands, filtering through limestone, emerging as springs that flow into the sea to begin the cycle again. The village rests within this movement, part of patterns that preceded human existence and will continue long after. And in acknowledging the limits of what we can recover, in sitting comfortably with questions that may never find complete answers, we honor the complexity of lives lived in earnest under those unchanging stars. The stones remember in their way, holding whatever imprint 9 millennia of water flow has carved. The spring remembers its source, emerging constant despite all surface transformation. The stars remember their courses, following paths set by forces that dwarf human scale. You're still here, wherever here is for you. The room around you, the darkness or light, the temperature of air on skin. Breath moving in and out, heart beating, in rhythm slower now than when this began. The ancient village rests beneath its waters. The stones stand in their circle. The spring flows with patience that measures time in geological rather than human increments. And somewhere between your listening and their building, across 9,000 years of distance, a connection holds, fragile as attention, strong as the curiosity that makes us human, enduring as stone.